Hey everybody, you're in the ring. It's a byline bonus round. Ding, ding, ding. I could have probably edited a sound effect in there, but I thought that this was a little bit more off the cuff and maybe even organic. Well, today I am doing a sidebar, a breakout right now from the professor, how journalists can meet the moment of polarization. There's a lot of infighting online. We know this over the last decade with the dawn of social media, with the nationalization of politics in our news consumption. I am going to a professor at Syracuse University of how she believes that journalists can meet this moment and maybe establish some trust that might have been lost as longstanding outlets where objective journalists, traditionally trained journalists, are lumped into media platforms, whether it be social media or YouTube, etc., and where creators and influencers also exist, and how possibly in this moment of AI, when people might be going to chatbots or even journalists possibly weighing whether they use chatbots, go into the profession to try and remain credible, but also adapt to the seismic shift that we're in right now of how people consume news. Emily Sydnor is an associate professor at Syracuse University's Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship. It's based in Washington, D.C. She was previously an associate professor at Southwestern University in political science. So her research is looking at the intersection of journalism, democracy, trust in our institutions, and meeting the moment that we're in to possibly rebuild some of that. So this is a byline bonus round where there's some excerpts from an interview that I had with Emily recently, some advice that she thinks journalists may consider and take away and could use in their day-to-day. So let's dive in. And joining me now on Byline is Emily Sydnor, an associate professor at Syracuse University's Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship. It happens to be in Washington, D.C. There are many collegiate programs, we were just talking off camera, that now have these classroom settings in the district outside of where their home bases are, where people can, especially journalists, journalism students, can kind of dip their toe into the water of politics, democracy, and journalism. I was lucky enough to go through that at Penn State University, and Syracuse has a similar program. Emily, first off, thank you for joining Byline. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
And what I try to do here on Byline outside of my 9 to 5, which, as you know, the news business is a phony term because we are always wired any time of the day to do the job, is go beyond the headlines and really explain why they matter to people, spend some good amount of time to do it with the intersection of journalism, the media in general, which is, a dirty word the journalists, can lament right now, and politics and where we go from here in this age of AI. So I thought your background too, as a previous associate professor at Southwestern, where you taught political science, and now you're in the journalism world, I thought you'd be a great person to dive in. So thank you.
Of course. Glad to be here.
I took note of the top of your bio, and that was the quote, key main forces damaging trust in journalism and democracy. It's something that you dive in on, and I kind of want to separate the two if I could. Journalism and democracy, what's really damaging the public perception, the reliability of how people believe the news is affecting their daily lives, but also the politicians who are keeping our democracy alive for better or for worse right now. So let me just start right now with the state of journalism today. What do you think the biggest forces are right now that are damaging trust in journalism?
Oh, the biggest, I think there's a lot of different places we could start, right? So, if we think about sort of broad institutions, right, we can talk about sort of the decline in local news. And this is something that my colleagues at the IDJC have done a lot of research into, right? That when you don't have as much access to sort of community-based news that's not talking about politics through this sort of national Democrats versus Republicans lens, right, then it's harder to think about politics in any other way than, okay, here's what's happening in the national arena. Here are the sort of teams and how they're being put against each other. So we could talk about the decline of local news, the change in economic structures for a lot of both traditional media and more online journalism, and the ways in which focus on clicks and views changes the incentives for the kind of news we report and the way we report it. We could talk about politicians and the ways they talk about the media and its value to a democratic society. So, I think we can dig into any of those if
Sure.
they sort of strike your interest, but I think those are some good sort of broad places to start.
Well, I think I've had this conversation with many journalists, with many political science analysts as well, and that is the nationalization of politics, which
Mhm.
just you mentioned. City council members are being asked what their position is about peace in the Middle East when they have,
Right.
they have no power to make any change there. And why would they need to answer to that? They should be focusing arguably on roads and bridges,
Mhm.
things that impact our daily life, taking out trash. So let me go 30,000 feet. When people say they don't trust the media,
Mhm.
right? Which journalists who've gone through objective training in institutions that have longstanding trust, do you think that because the information people are getting now are all accessible wherever they want on Instagram, vetted journalists are mixed in with editorialists without any, labeling their YouTubers and podcasters who are just commenting on news of the day. It's all in one pot versus people would sit down at 7 o'clock at night and watch one of the
Right.
3, 4 main networks or read their local longstanding, Chicago Tribune, New York Times, Washington Post. Is that the root here of why people just don't trust vetted journalists because they're now in this pot with everybody else?
I mean, I think that's probably part of it, right? I'd have to go back and look at like the stats, right? But my understanding of sort of some of the research is that it's not that people don't trust or they don't trust the media, as you sort of, alluded with the air quotes before,
Uh-huh.
but they do trust their media, right? And in the same way that people don't trust Congress, but they like their own congressperson, there's a distinction that we need to make between right the institution as a whole and the way that people perceive it as a sort of overarching thing, and then the media that they consume themselves, right? And so some of that comes again back to partisanship and our own personal preferences in terms of right, humans in general don't like to be sort of continuously bombarded with things that challenge their values that they disagree with. Some of that is good, but we can increasingly pick media that reinforce our own perspectives or that at least are giving us a perspective that we find palatable, right? And so we trust that sort of news, whether it's coming from journalists that have been trained in right objective traditional journalism or from podcasters and commentators, right? The challenge is then teaching people, I think, how to appreciate the process of objective journalism, right? The training that goes into being right, someone like you, as opposed to right there are sort of assumptions that a journalist is much like an influencer or a podcaster, bringing their own perspective into the conversation and right is therefore biased in some way.
Yeah, you what you're talking about right now, it makes me think about this how we got here with confirmation bias and and
Hmm.
and and accepting anything that we see online as truth because we already agree with it. Before I get into how typical objective journalists can possibly rebuild some of that trust, which is big, it's a big component of what you're looking at and teaching your students, and I have a couple of ideas here too, and I want to hear from you. I want to ask what were the main driving forces, do you think, and maybe you've already answered it, social media, that people are now in this world of confirmation bias when, even before they go onto a platform and consume information?
I mean, I think a lot of it we can trace back to sort of cable news and the 24-hour news network and the idea that in order to fill 24 hours of news as opposed to the 7 p.m. broadcast, right, you have to not only expand sort of what you are counting as news and the extent to which you sort of are talking about it, but also the perspective from which you're talking, right? You're competing with these other markets, other outlets, and what's the new thing that's being brought to the table by Fox, CNN, MSNBC. Some of it is about like topical perspective, right? How do we think about politics through the lens of the markets and economic forces? But some of it is a partisan perspective, right? And so the access to more content that is coming from a particular perspective makes it easier to engage in the sort of selective news choice that people can do now. And so it starts with cable news and then it right grows with social media, it grows with right internet news sort of more broadly, right? So not just social media as a platform, but just the sheer number of networks, outlets, things that are publishing both real news and things that we might call sort of news in quotation marks, right?
Right, more of an editorialism. So let me ask, journalism during medium shifts, we've gone through this before.
Mhm.
Newspapers, to radio, to television, and now 24-hour news cycle with cable news and now social media. Kept forward, we're in this age of AI right now. We've gone through a lot of technological shifts before. How different does this one feel right now?
What an interesting question. um, I think in some ways it feels like a sort of obvious extension of what's already been happening, right? If you think about maybe less about the development from, cable to online to social media, but instead about sort of technological development and like the platforms, I guess. There it feels sort of like, okay, this is the next step, right? We went from, having to use an encyclopedia to being able to Google things. And now Google presents the AI summary of the kinds of things that it
Right.
has found at the top.
Which
And
seems somewhat, which seems concerning because all of these AI platforms, and I say that from the surface, but all these platforms are doing is they're aggregating content that's already out there, but we don't necessarily know for certain. Like if you ask a chatbot, I want vetted sources for X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 blah. Unless you look at the source where that information is coming from, you might fall into the trap of accepting whatever they generate at face
right.
value.
And this is, one of the challenges as we sort of think about AI and the contributions of AI in this context is to be really specific about what is the AI that we're talking about here, right? So if we're using AI for information search, then this is the concern that we might have, right? That it is only as good as the sort of information that it's training from and that it can search. And so it runs into the same challenges that any other information search sort of technology has. And then because it looks sort of better than a traditional Google search where you are picking from a variety of links, you might fail to click through, right? And that's a problem because you might get false information. You might get something from a website that's not as reliable or that has its own framing of a particular issue or candidate or something like that.
Do you think you mentioned it because whatever the AI platforms are generating, it quote unquote looks better. Is it because it looks better because it's quicker and it gets you an answer faster? You don't have to keep searching around for things?
Yeah, so I think some of it's efficiency, right? So if you just want to know, I mean, I fall into this trap all of the time, right? I want to know, when a particular event happened. Let me just Google it really quickly. I get the AI summary. I'm probably not going to click through to the link and make sure that the date that the AI summary gives me is the right one, right? I should, because who knows, right?
Mhm.
But that is one of the motivations that we hear from people about why they're using AI for things is this like quick efficiency. I think some of it is also about it's nicely presented in paragraphs or bullet points, and it's easily digestible in a way that, if you're looking for information, you have to sift through a set of links. You might have to click through different ones. You have to make sure that it's at a reading level that you understand, that the concepts are easily digestible to you, and that might take a few links. So the other advantage, I think, or perceived advantage of an AI summary on something like Google is that it is digesting the material and synthesizing it in at a grade level that most people can understand. Again, that opens it up to the possibility of perspective shifts, falsehoods, etc.
Sure.
But I think that's part of what makes it appealing.
Let me get into what I think you might be discussing quite frequently with your students right now, and they have questions. They're getting into journalism at a time of seismic shift. And I want to talk about adapting to this moment right now. AI is here. There are going to be nefarious actors out there who want to instill new ways of misinformation. Journalists, how can we adapt to this moment without compromising ethical, objective standards, the values that we're taught to, stay objective and finding truth rather than balance? Because I know that there's definitely a difference here.
Yes.
There's fairness and truth, different, I would say, than balance, right? So how do we adapt to this moment right now? Because for me, I've now been turning out Instagram Reels and TikToks of what a typical TV news package is, a minute and 30 piece. And I'm making it more digestible, engaging with, certain graphics on Instagram and on TikTok. But I personally don't feel like I am, giving up any of my standards that I think we should approach the job with. But in order to not only adapt with the AI and the platforms that we're at right now and how people consume news, but also maybe build back some of this trust, how would you start to tackle all of this?
I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of ways we could go with this conversation, right? And one is to think about, right, like how do we build AI literacy, both in citizens and in journalists, right? So if part of your role as a journalist is to, identify when candidates are using deepfake images or they've produced AI generated content in, whatever capacity, it seems like most of what I see right now is images, but maybe it's that images are easier potentially to identify than text. That, right, it's the role of the journalist to be able to have again, objective strategies for identifying that, to discuss what the implications of that are, and sort of raise those considerations to help readers understand what's going on here. And then it is also readers' role to engage in some of those same practices, right? So that when they are being exposed to claims about media online or presentation of something that looks like an outlet has done something nefarious or something that would decline people's trust, that they can also use those same literacy skills to evaluate the extent to which what they're seeing is true or false. My sense from some of the research that other social scientists, political scientists, communication scholars are doing out there is that people trust AI integration into journalism, governance, et cetera, most when they can see how the human is still involved in the process. So most people, right, seem to have less of a problem with journalists, say, using AI in their process if it's about, right, sort of generating images or editing or things like that. They're sort of assuming that you're already doing a lot of those things. But knowing that a human is exercising oversight over whatever it is the AI is producing tends to make people trust the process more. And so being transparent as a media organization or a journalist about, here's what I have used these sorts of things for, here's how I've checked it and made sure that in the end, I'm the one making the decision and not the AI, can go a long way, I think.
Let's go down this rabbit hole of transparency. Do you think that it would be a good idea for, I'd say, journalists when they tell their stories, when they deliver their stories, obviously without compromising sources, to basically show and explain how they got to whatever information they provided? Would that be a possible avenue among many to help establish some more trust or build back some of that trust?
I mean, I certainly think it can't hurt. I haven't looked at the sort of literature on transparency and trust recently, but my sense is that any sort of transparency around the journalistic process, right? Helping the average American doesn't know a journalist who's been through journalism school, right? And so they don't understand what the objective process is, and they have other people that they listen to and trust telling them, journalists are so biased, they're just out there to report, whatever fits their views. And so helping people understand that, no, this is a process, the way the scientific method is a process that helps us arrive at better options. That's not just about AI, that's about transparency about the whole process, right? How do you choose sources? How do you write a story? How do you come up with ideas? How do you decide which quotes to use or not? My sense is that all of those, transparency around all of those decisions can help increase trust.
What are some of the biggest questions your students are asking you right now? Maybe not the hardest to answer philosophical questions, but rather the most frequent questions that you think meet the moment we're in with this technological shift that we're all facing.
I mean, I think a lot of them are trying to figure out what the balance is between using and the narrative that they are hearing repeatedly that they need to have AI skills to succeed in the workforce moving forward, right? That they hear from, recruiters at maybe not in news, but in other spaces about how there's a decline in entry-level jobs because AI can do a lot of that work. There's expectations. We had someone from a public relations firm come to a workshop last summer who basically said, I'm not hiring an intern unless they can use AI effectively, right? That we use it so much in our practice that they need to be able to come in understanding how to use a variety of AI tools. And, I think that's very different from what universities are trying to figure out with students. And so the conversations that we have around when are they using it? How are they using it? What are the useful ways to engage with AI? What are not, right? Having it write your paper, less helpful. Engaging with it to, present a problem and get a sense of, what are some strategies that it can find that might be useful, that might be more helpful, right?
I'm going to ask you about the tension between what performs well online and what best serves the public.
Hmm.
And this kind of goes back to your point about folks will consume or at least believe news that already affirms their own bias. We all have bias, right? I have my own bias. You have your own bias as well, but I'm not paid to be biased. So I leave that at home, right? But let me go back to this because there are so many influencers that are out there, or even just commentators who they're espousing their own views, and guess what? They have the freedom to do it. It's the First Amendment. Good on them. But the platforms are ultimately rewarding folks or promoting. We've seen this content that brings people back for more that may already affirm their own bias. So how do journalists continue to stay relevant and break through all of that when the platforms seem to be the gatekeepers here?
So I think there's two pieces to what you just said, right? One is a sort of what can journalists do to engage in sort of the creator economy, right? And this is something that Syracuse and the IDJC are really trying to think more about right now, just in the sort of like ideas phase, right? But the sense that journalists increasingly have to have their own personal brand. They have to be able to engage on these platforms that reward a sort of different set of values than objective journalism training does. And what are the ways that you can blend the two to the response that you want while also staying true to, right, the sort of core tenets of.
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, so I think, the one that comes to mind, I think for me off the top of my head, is sort of where the Washington Post was headed with their TikTok sort of pre-shakeup. I haven't seen as much from it since they did all the layoffs several
Right.
months ago. But right, that they had cultivated particular, right, they had trained journalists doing real reporting, but doing it in a way that was more appealing to the platform, right, and to the people who were using that platform. And it's funny. I talked about this with a group of high school teachers back in May, and I showed them content from the Post TikTok, and they were all like, everything about this makes me so uncomfortable, right? Like the journalism doesn't feel the same. It's super fast, right? It's clearly not designed for those of us that are, 40 or older and used to a particular version of sort of news presentation.
Right.
But it clearly does appeal to a younger set of viewers, and right is getting hits and getting people to pay attention. And
I mean, it was shocking when we were first starting to look at these videos, especially when you had longstanding trusted outlets like the Washington Post taking on this brand new different format. I remember going, oh, wow, okay, this is very, very, very different. But I find that we're now already in this field, and we're now in the moment, as you mentioned right now, where people have to establish a brand that breaks through, that is engaging to a specific audience and brings them back for more. So do you think maybe we're in the age of like one specific reporter, I don't know, maybe establishes their own style that they're repeatedly delivering the news on social media, their own graphics, if you will, in order for people to come back, and then maybe even newsrooms are doing the same thing as well?
Yeah, I mean, putting it on the journalist feels like a lot, right? That being able to have the backing of an institution, the resources of an institution, I think are still really important. But thinking about what it is that specific journalists and newsrooms could do to sort of increase the accessibility and authenticity of, or portrayed authenticity, maybe is the better word, of the journalists to fit into the sort of platform specific things, right? The things that people want from that platform, the things that, if you get your news from TikTok, you are looking for a particular sort of version of the news. And it's not about left or right or even drama necessarily. It's just about how does it get portrayed in that kind of video space? What like backgrounds are you using, or costumes, or what's your shtick, right? So like Under the Desk News, right, is successful in part because of the way that they landed on a particular approach, right? Being under the desk instead of reporting at the desk.
Right.
And that was connected to sort of what they were trying to do with journalism. And that appealed to a set of people. Yeah, I sort of forget where I was going with that, I'll be honest. But
No, that's all right, because we're in this moment of where people are trying to stay relevant without compromising values. So on top of what I presume you're teaching your students, and that is typical ethical standards, not Maybe even because I was funny. I went to school at a time where Penn State was offering a print and digital
Mhm.
major for journalism, and there was a broadcast major to which I did not get that major, but I ended up interning in broadcast spaces, and that was the route I wanted to go down. But I liked that because I appreciated the black and white approach of teaching a journalist of how to report and finding facts just on paper or on a screen at the get-go versus also trying to juggle how to keep the audience engaged visually, which is where we're at right now. So let me ask, what are some of the biggest bullet points or lessons that you're teaching your students right now about how to not only keep those traditional reporting standards if they do go on to this profession, but also how to stay or keep audiences engaged? Because as you said, it shouldn't always be on the reporter to do that, but depending on whether your outlet is putting out your stories on social media or not, you might have to do that.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll be honest, I don't teach as many of the practical journalism classes. And so I'm not sure I have as good of an answer because, right, I have all sorts of colleagues who are trained journalists who are back in the classroom sharing their expertise and talking through those sorts of issues with students. And so I sort of leave the really sort of practical, how do you do this like in your day-to-day job part
That's
to
fair.
them. But again, I think I think you as an individual and a journalist have to decide to some extent, like what are you willing to do on social media, right? I think almost any professional has to figure this out now. What is your professional brand? What does that manifest? How does that manifest on social media? Whether that's, in academia, for a long time, it was your presence on Twitter or X, right? Now it's,
Right.
shifted to other platforms. But, I would think about, I have my professional social media and presence on one platform. I have personal ones elsewhere. My sense is that my journalism students are even better at thinking through that and are doing that at an even earlier time so that they can sort of present the professional version of themselves that they want for these contexts.
Let me zoom out a little bit, and that is the intersection of journalism and democracy. Do you think democracy can function well if people don't share a common set of facts?
I think it's pretty hard, right? We need to have, I mean, a set of facts, a set of values, political culture. I think we can debate which thing needs to be shared, but sort of fundamentally at the like core of a democracy is the assumption that everyone is going into the democratic experience open to listening to and not even adopting, but considering the adoption of other people's ideas, perspectives, policies, et cetera. Right. And so, we might come in with different facts or a different set of facts that we think are relevant. Right. I think
Mm,
fundamentally disagreeing about, like, is something red or green is different from, I think the color is more important than the shape or something like that, right? If you can't agree on the facts or you can't sit down and try to understand why you have different sets of facts or different priorities, then it's much harder to, right, sort of engage in a broader democratic discourse.
how do you think that folks who are not the platform moderators, but journalists as well, can help folks from retreating into their separate information ecosystems, if that even is our part of our responsibility right now?
And I think some of it is just reminding people that having conversations with people that you disagree with is not as terrible as you think. So, right, there's a whole bunch of psychological research that suggests that people are really nervous and anxious about going into disagreeable conversations. And then they have those conversations and they're like, oh, that actually wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I would be willing to have those sorts of conversations again. And so there's this anticipatory piece that we need to try to break down, I think, to say these conversations are important. They might get a little uncomfortable, but they're not going to be, wholly unpleasant, and you will still be friends at the end. And there's a mindset that can go with that. And so once, you know, journalists, people just online in general can both perhaps rein in their outrage a little bit and their tendency towards exaggeration and inflammation, and work to produce spaces where we can have more productive conversations. I think that's a good first step.
If you were teaching every journalism school in the United States this fall, what would be your very first lesson?
Um,
Maybe it's something you're working on right now.
I think it would be that we really need to break down what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about some of these broad sea changes, right? So like even AI in this conversation that we've been having today, right? We've focused primarily on the ways in which AI serves as an aggregator and like approach to generating information or content that can be shared, right? But if we think about, say, AI as a chatbot, right, the kind that we might actually have a back and forth with instead of just saying, hi, can you write this paper for me or generate this image, right? AI chatbots, if when people engage with them, have been found to reduce conspiracy theories in people's minds and make them more open to having conversations, right? They've shown the ability to potentially depolarize people after conversations with chatbots. And so when we say, like, oh, what's the effect of AI on news or on democracy? We really have to be specific about what is it about AI that we're focusing on? What is it about news, right? Is it the process? Is it the consumption? What are the important democratic principles we're focusing on, et cetera? That's probably like 10 things, but
Yeah, it is. But that's okay. Here's a fun one. What habits should journalists stop doing right now?
um I mean, I think to the extent, and maybe this is because I think university professors should be doing this to some extent also, but we can't just write off AI as something that is only sort of problematic for our profession, right? That there are lots of ways in which it can benefit us, it can make tasks easier, it can help us reflect more on our own positions, beliefs, etc. And that is not to say that I think we should all turn around and start using it, for all of our day-to-day tasks, but thinking critically about what is the value added in what ways, again, thinking about which AI tools are better or worse for us, I think is something we could do. And maybe I'm sort of lumping everybody into too broad of a stereotype to say that I think journalists share university professors' sort of hesitancy towards this technology and see more concerns rather than value added from it at this point.
Well, let me go back to this whole chatbot situation. You're talking about people can leave conversations with an AI chatbot with a better understanding of, I don't know, the entire scope of a specific issue. Is that because the AI platforms are able to aggregate so much information? And is that where you're going here?
So it depends a little, right? A lot of this comes down to, right, you can design different, best as I can tell, because I am not, that we're getting into sort of a computer science landscape.
Some of the computer science engineering, yeah,
But
perspective
but
here.
sort of bracketing that I have limited knowledge here, right? You can program AIs to say, okay, like drawing on all of the data that you have access to, I want you to have a conversation with someone in which you are, right, you exhibit sort of high conversational capabilities. You act as if you're listening, right? So here is what it looks like to be an active listener. We want you to use those principles as a chatbot, right? If you can tell it to do those things, and then you put someone in a conversation with it, and you say, okay, this person's going to give all of the arguments for one of their sort of most polarized political positions. So let's say they are staunchly anti-abortion. They enter the chatbot, situation. They have a conversation with this chatbot. The chatbot makes arguments from a pro-abortion perspective using all of these conversational style strategies that I was just talking about. And in the sort of study that did this, they found that it depolarized people. So they moderated their issue positions somewhat. They were more willing to have conversations with other humans about this issue. They were less sort of negative towards those people, right? So one of the big problems with polarization in the US is not actually about how far away from each other we are on issues, but how emotionally we feel about the other side. And so one of the things that these chatbot studies have shown is that under the right conditions, people can leave those conversations and say, hey, I don't hate partisans from the other persuasion as much as I thought.
Well, I'd be curious if some of these AI platforms start rolling out chatbots where, I mean, you can create your own chatbot that could possibly affirm your own views and and tweak your own arguments in a specific type of debate. Yeah, I assume that the study you were looking at was a chatbot that I guess might have been like a Chat GPT general or
Yeah,
a Claude general, something like that.
I don't remember like what the specific GPT was, but yeah, so, I think that's certainly an interesting finding. Of course, we can counteract it with, you could design the opposite, right? And that this is one of the the big challenges we have to figure out sort of as a society is, like what are the rules and regulations around the development of some of these things? It's wonderful to know that we can develop ones that have really positive political dialogues, but I can also imagine concerns about the ability to have really negative ones. And there's enough of that, I think.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of people can agree with that. 5 years from now, what do you think journalism will look like?
I hope in many ways it looks the same, right? That it's still committed to a spirit of objectivity, to reporting the truth, to offering evidence and giving people the information that they need to understand really complex problems and institutions that are facing, society today. I suspect it will be sort of even more online and potentially more individualized.
Do you fear that some of the service journalism stories might go away? The community, events that are going to be happening, or anything that it can be inputted online by a human, and a platform can just scoop up and spit it out to the user. But some of the more investigative type pieces that actually rely on human to human interaction, that's going to stay alive.
I mean, maybe, right? I think, again, sort of going back to the point of people trust the information and the sources more when there's still the human in there means that even the information that would be easy to sort of offload to AI will still need some sort of human integration involved. And
in order to maintain that trust.
right. And that I don't think any of those things are going to go away because those are still many of the things that people want out of their resources right now. I suppose it could shift who is doing that, right? Is there some other organization that's going to provide community notes and details about city council meetings and things like that? No one has stepped in, really, right? But there are some innovative ways, in my understanding, that local journalists are trying to, work with citizens and interested parties to make sure that things like City Hall are getting notes covered and still being reported on in local communities. And so, 5 years from now, I don't think that's going away, in part because there's a whole set of people who understand the importance of that information and that investigation to, both our day-to-day lives and the broader success of our democracy.
Emily, I appreciate your insight and your candor. Thank you. And but let's stay in touch because I think we're, like I said, we're in a seismic moment where you are trying to analyze the tech that we're all been presented and how to teach your students how to live in this moment and adjust. And who knows, in 10 years that might change too. So let that not be a doom and gloom scenario. But I do appreciate your candor, so thank you.
Of course, this has been great, and I'm sure I'll have entirely different answers for you the next time we chat. So. Looking forward to seeing how everything evolves.
Such is the unpredictability of the news industry. So there's that.
Wonderful.
Right.
Wonderful.
Emily, thank you.
Of course, thank you.
All right, some pieces of advice, maybe things to consider from Emily from a journalistic perspective as we are increasingly delivering news on social media platforms, or maybe even considering how to use AI in our reporting to not only strengthen it, but also to maybe add some efficiency and what she feels is a way to use AI without diminishing viewers' trust, consumers' trust in journalists to report their news, labeling, maybe even explaining how AI is incorporated into our news reporting. So with that, I'll see you around. Take it easy, everybody.